So today I'm going to be talking about the topic of what we mean when we say anti-racism in other terms. So um, when we talk about the whole idea of race, it's important that we understand and acknowledge that it's a socially constructed idea. Race is a socially constructed idea created by Europeans during a period of worldwide colonial expansion for the purpose of concentrating power among white people and legitimizing their dominance over non whites. A large body of scientific research has shown that there's no biological basis for the standard racial categories that we use today. However, race is still real in the sense that a person's skin color plays a large role in determining their life outcome and experience. Despite the fact that racial categories are not scientifically based, most scholars and activists agree that using race as a political and or social category remains necessary as a tool to help us understand the persistent structural inequalities and discriminations. And so today I'm going to share a little bit about these various different terms that we're going to be using over the next 5 weeks. So, when we talk about racial groups, it's important to also note that many of these racial categories are more from a scholarly standpoint, right? And so, what I mean by that is you may encounter an individual who doesn't necessarily want to be referred in that particular way. And if that's how they don't want to be referred, then you need to defer to how they, as an individual, would want to be referred, right? So when we talk about Black, in general, we use the term Black rather than African American, unless we are specifically referring to people of African descent. The term Black is more inclusive than African American because it includes people of African and Caribbean, South America descent whose identity as Black, who identify as Black, and share a common racialized experience in the United States based on their skin color. Another racial category is Hispanic or Latinx. The term Hispanic and Latinx are not interchangeable. Hispanic refers to a language, while Latinx refers to geography. When we're referring to people of Latin American descent, sometimes scholars like to use the term Latinx because it's gender neutral. A lot of people I know prefer Latino or Latin or Hispanic, and that's why it's really important that you ask people how they prefer to be identified. Native American, American Indian, or Indigenous people tends to reflect or describe Indigenous folks. Some people have said that when we talk about the word people of color, it doesn't necessarily include Native Americans. And so we'll get into another term that is often used in the last 3 or 4 years. Then when we talk about Asian, it's a person having origins in any of Asia, India, Pacific Islands, China, Japan, Thailand, Vietnam. And there's more to that too. And also we have Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders. And these are typically referring to people who are of Hawaiian or Pacific or from the Pacific Islands. When we talk about people of color, this is usually a term referred to collectively refer to non-white or non-native people. In recent years, people have started to use BIPOC, BIAP, people of color, which is short for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So that's a term that we'll use a lot. We use this abbreviation to really kind of refer to people and also to refer to people of color, but also to include Black and Indigenous people of color in the United States, whose experiences are not all the time summed up when we talk about people of color. White, then, is the term used to collectively refer to people defined primarily by light-colored skin as well. Okay, racism. When we talk about racism, it's important to understand that racism is both a system of advantage and a system of oppression, right? So it's a system of advantage for whites, while it's a system of oppression for Black, Indigenous people of color. the system was created to concentrate social and institutional power among those designated as white and excludes all others from receiving these benefits. Then, when we use the word prejudice or to prejudge, it's usually negative and it's based on a bias or stereotype rather than on an individual's characteristic or person. Prejudice prevents people from being recognized and treated as individuals, and it can be very damaging towards those who are oppressed or marginalized people. When we talk and use the word oppression, it refers to the systematic disadvantaging, marginalizing, devaluing, and subjugation of one social group by another. In order for that social group to have more power, to have more social, economic, or political benefit over the other groups. Two scholars, Rita Hardman and Bailey Jackson, describe 4 elements of oppression. They say that oppression consists of 1, the more powerful group having the power to define what is normal, what is correct, or what is real for themselves and for others. Then the second thing they say is various forms of unequal treatment, such as harassment and discrimination, are systematically and institutional for those in the group that's not in power. Then they say the oppressed group is socialized to internalize this negative message about themselves and cooperate in their own oppression by thinking and acting like the more powerful group. And then last, they say the cultural, language, and history of the more powerful group is imposed as normal, while the culture, language, and history of oppressed group are misrepresented, devalued, or eradicated. Now, one term I want to make sure we understand is whiteness. And so when we say whiteness, it's not the same as when we say white when we're talking about race, but whiteness is a powerful social and political construct. The idea of whiteness is an ideology that is founded on the belief of a supremacy of one over and against another. It is an ideology that defines reality and sees it as a way to influence society, systems, and ways of being. One author puts it this way and says that whiteness attaches privilege to being white, male, heterosexual, non-disabled, and based on your class. Whiteness can cause psychological and spiritual damage to white people just as it damages non-whites. White Americans are imbued with whiteness from infancy. They do not choose it for themselves. People who look white and who have immigrated to America are generally afforded whiteness upon arrival, whether they want it or not. In her book, White Fragility, Why Is It So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism?, Robin DiAngelo identifies 3 dimensions of whiteness. She talks about the structural advantage, a privileged position within society, and its institution for whites. For example, do you know that most CEOs of major corporations, political leaders, and heads of large organizations are white? She talks about it from a standpoint from which white people look at themselves, others, and at society, one that allows them to see themselves as individuals and just human. And third, she says, it's a set of cultural practices that are not named and acknowledged, norms and actions that consistently create and perpetuate advantages for whites and disadvantages for Black, Indigenous people of color. She argues that these dimensions of whiteness each have benefits for whites and are usually invisible to white people. Peggy McIntosh also talks a lot about this concept of white privilege. And essentially, she uses this whole analogy of like a knapsack, an invisible knapsack that has these special types of provisions, maps, passport, code book, clothes, blank checks that are given to white people. She talks about these privileges being given to institutions or societies solely based on race. In other words, these are unearned privileges or advantages that many people experience because they are white. These privileges make their lives less stressful, give them a competitive edge, and result in the unequal distribution of resources and rewards. So, some examples that she gives of white privilege in the knapsack is that white people can turn on the television or open onto the front page of paper and see people of their race widely represented. She used to use the example that white people can choose blemish coverage or bandage, like a flesh color bandage. In 2020, with everything that happened, more band aid companies decided to make different tones of band aids recently. White people do not have to educate their children to be aware of systematic racism for their own daily physical protection, meaning white people don't have to give their children the talk about what to do when you get pulled over by the cops. So, those are some examples of what she calls white privilege. So then when we talk about anti-racism, according to Ijoma Alua, she says that anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And it's the only way forward. Let me say that again. It's a commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. It's not about having all the right answers, right? It's not about knowing all the right things, but rather it's about being aware, understanding, and then choosing to make a commitment to fighting it when you see it, even when you see it within yourself. This involves a process of us then actively oppressing, identifying oppression and racism. That includes challenging racism that we see in policies, behaviors, beliefs that perpetuate racism, racist ideas, and actions. Another word that we'll talk about is anti-Blackness. And so that word, the Council for Democratizing Education defines anti-Blackness in two parts. It says that it voids Blackness of value while systematically marginalizing Black people and their issues. They see it in two forms. The first is anti-Blackness is overt racism in structures, policies, institutions, and ideologies. The second form of anti-Blackness is an unethical disregard for anti-Black institutions and policies. This disregard is the product of class, race, and gender privilege that certain individuals experience due to anti-Black institutions and policies. So I want to talk briefly about this whole concept of identity, and then we're going to watch a quick video. So when we talk about identity, Jen, you had a question. Go ahead. You're muted.
I don't want to disrupt the flow, but
No,
I
go
do
ahead.
have something. Okay, so all of these, I'm getting an echo. I don't know if
You're fine. Go ahead.
Okay, so the concept of race being a concept is very new to me. So of all the stuff that I've read, I think that one it's so fundamental, and so I just want to kind of hear a little bit more about that if possible. Like, for instance, when we fill out forms for the government or for schools, the question is race, right? And so, and yet there is also ethnicity. Can you say something about the difference between the two, so I can maybe sort of grasp what race is and how it was constructed to perpetuate the system?
Sure. So when we talk about race as a social construct, it's important for us to understand that initially these different phenotypes were created by looking at the human skull, right? And so the initial person who started to kind of categorize different people, categorized them based on images that he saw in the human skull, and began to say that these particular people, because their skull was a certain size, only had only had certain mental capacity, right? And so, and then it would be that those who were European descent had a different shape of skull, and so therefore they were seen as more inferior, more intelligent. And so when you think about, and so essentially what happened is as this became seen as something within the scientific community, as something to be grabbed upon, it started to be used in other ways as well. One of the things that we will spend time on talking about in the coming weeks is how race has been used to continue to subjugate certain people. And so part of the ways in which race is a social construct, it's not biological. That's super important for us to understand. And so it's been created in such a way to prop up a particular group of people over and against others. Right. And so what that means, what that has meant is over centuries and generations, as we began to define Black people, some of the ways in which Black people have historically been defined is as lacking intelligence, as inferior, as those who are lustful, all of those who are more savage. And when you think not just about the ways in which Black people have been defined, it continues on this black and white continuum where white people are seen as more superior, and then everyone else along the continuum, it gets farther and further and further away, and so it's less than human, right? And so part of the reason that this is a social construct is if you're going to oppress any people group, then there has to be a level of cognitive dissonance in order for you to justify the oppression of anyone else that is human. Right. And so one of the main ways in which slavery was able to exist is because of the belief that they were less than human, right? That people who were Black were less than human. And so when we talk about it being a social construct, it's important for us to understand that it's not biological, but it's been created by society in a way in order to create control over certain people group. Did that answer your question, Jen? I can't see you.
Oops, shoot. Did I? Okay, I pinned myself. Okay, so then if I'm understanding it correctly, it has always seemed very odd to me that the term race was used to describe people's ethnicity.
So, right. So race and ethnicity are not the same thing.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So race is the social construct that we talked about. Race is those typical categories when you click a box and you say race: white, Black, Latino, Asian, and that's been one of the things that they're continuing to redefine. Ethnicity is different. Ethnicity derives from your sense of shared heritage, history, traditions, values, and area of origin, right? So when we talk about people of African descent, that's their ethnic identity, right? So when we talk about people from Germany, that's their ethnic identity, right? And that's different from racial identity. Yeah.
Just one more comment. So then So though this construct was created initially out of an impulse to subjugate people, nevertheless, still it's a helpful term today because we're kind of working our way through understanding and recognizing what it's come to, what it is. Is that,
correct?
Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, right. So it is a social construct, and it's the social construct that we've been given, right? Yeah. And so in order for us to even understand what we mean when we say things like systematic oppression or systematic racism, then we need to be able to utilize this construct that has existed in order to then define and see what happens when we're talking about systematic racism.
Okay.
And I went fast through these terms, and I'm going to be sending them out to you all in an email so that you all have them as well. Any other questions before I move on to there? Just go ahead and raise your hand or unmute yourself and start to talk. Cool.
About the socialization, Tracy, can you talk a little bit more about that? About how non-white people are socialized?
When you say, you mean socialized around white privilege, or?
Yeah, when you mentioned the oppressed group is socialized. So it's sort of incorporated to adapt to this social construct of we're powerful, you're not.
Yeah. So, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, I believe, next week after we watch the film. I'm not your Negro, but we're going to talk a little bit more about what it means when you have been taught over and over and over again, systemically through school, through media, through a variety of venues that you are less than. Eventually what ends up happening is everyone inherits those particular narratives, right? Those people who are, as we share those narratives and they become internalized, right? And so when we internalize those narratives, whether we are a Black person, an Indigenous person, a person of color, or whether we're white, when we internalize those particular narratives about individuals, it then impacts and shapes how we then interact with each other, how we see ourselves, how we see one another in the world. That's where a lot of like our prejudice come in, our stereotypes kind of come in, because they began to be shaped around these ideas, these ideologies, and these controlling narratives that shape and form how we view and see one another. One of the things that's super important for us to kind of understand is this whole idea of the social construction of reality. And then I'll come back to the whole notion of intersectionality. But when we talk about the social construction of reality, Peter Berker wrote this book called The Social Construction of Reality. And essentially what he says is a society has different values that they want to perpetuate. And as they begin to want to perpetuate certain values, they become institutionalized. And they are then internalized by everyone within the society. And then as the society continues to grow, they then teach the next generation these particular beliefs and ideologies that will govern how we operate as a society, almost like our social contract as a society. One of the things that Peter talks about in his book, The Social Construction of Reality, is that even the most well-intentioned individuals will want to create a society with the most noble intentions in mind. However, whatever our sinful nature is often embedded in that, meaning that as we try to create these societies, those sinful parts of who we are and our sinful ideologies, our thoughts and beliefs will then be embedded in that society and in that culture, and will continue to kind of perpetuate itself in that way. Does that make sense? I lost Ted, so I'll just keep going on. I want to show us a quick video on this concept of intersectionality. And then I want to share a little bit more before we break into our groups.
We can't see the video.
For understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound.
You guys can't see the video?
No,
you can share your screen with us.
I told you guys I love tech. Can you see it now?
Yes, we see it.
Thanks.
intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit, it is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
Okay, I see a couple questions in the chat. So Susan, that's a really good question. So the intended definition of sinful in the whole idea of social construct is that, so when Peter and his co-author, when they're talking about sinful, they're really talking about the ways in which, as individuals are creating a particular social construct or a society as a whole, sometimes they're not necessarily looking to figure out a way that honors everyone in their view of it. And so when they talk about sinful, it's really just about ways in which it misses or it doesn't or it creates these I'm trying to think of the best way, because they're not necessarily coming from a theological standpoint when they talk about sinful. They're coming from a sociological standpoint when they talk about it. And so really they're talking about human behavior that often can create forms of oppression. So human behavior that seeks to benefit one over the other, human behavior that can be self-centered and self-focused on oneself and not on the greater good of the whole. Did I answer your question, Susan?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, cool. So I've talked a ton about terms, and but now I really want to kind of remind us why we're even here. And the only reason I spent a little time talking about these terms is because it's important that we have some type of shared language as we're going through this time together. So on March 13, 2020, Breonna Taylor was murdered in her home by officers seeking to serve a warrant at the wrong address. The officers involved in her shooting were not charged for murder. One of the officers, however, was charged with this wanton endangerment for firing bullets that went through Taylor's apartment and hitting her next door neighbor. In May, after being detained for trying to pass a counterfeit $20 bill, George Floyd was placed on the ground while an officer kneeled on his neck for 7 minutes and 46 seconds. Floyd cried out that he could not breathe, and then he cried out to his deceased mother until the life within him was drained. That scene of Floyd crying out to his deceased mother and saying that he could not breathe galvanized people to take action. and to take notice to the injustices that have been plaguing Black folks for generations. People took to the street to protest and declare that Black lives matter. Businesses began to put forth statements declaring their support. People around the world began to cry out and wonder, how can this even be? In many ways, it was an Emmett Till moment that brought to the forefront what Black folks have been experiencing for centuries in America. And witnessing what happened to Floyd, it helped to see what many people had been saying over the last decade since the murder of Mike Brown and Trayvon Martin. So they have been saying, we're not in a post-racial society. The work of the civil rights movement must continue to press on. In November, we elected this nation's first woman as VP of the United States, a Black woman, an Asian woman, a woman of color. And while this definitely is a reason to celebrate, we must not forget that we are still at a critical moment in our nation and in the church. 2020 made us all be still. And while we were still, we actually had the ability to see and to hear the voices of our brothers and sisters on the margins who have been crying out about the injustices they were experiencing. But beloved, we must keep moving, because on December 4th, Casey Goodson was fatally shot outside his home by a sheriff's deputy who's also a Baptist pastor, who in his sermons has described his ability to use force as a righteous release.
Oh, it has you.
He says that there is a release in our job that righteously we can actually have a use of force. On December 20th, Dr. Susan Moore died from COVID. She's a practicing physician, and she knew what she needed and requested that the doctors provide assistance for her pain, and she advocated for her needs. The doctors refused to listen and instead believed she was well enough to go home. Dr. Moore chronicled her story and saying that had it not been for the color of her skin, she would have been believed and not treated as someone who had an addiction to drugs. Dr. Moore eventually died from COVID-19. Adding to the disproportionate amount of Black people who've died from this virus. On December 28th, the president of that hospital said in a news statement that Dr. Moore simply intimidated the staff. And many saw these words of the hospital staff as a way of showing how Dr. Moore was really seen as an angry Black woman, instead of as a patient advocating for her needs. On December 26th, Keon Harold, a 14-year-old son, was attacked by a Simi Valley resident in a New York hotel who accused him of stealing her cell phone. And the hotel manager chose to side with the woman, who wasn't a guest, and insisted that Harold and his son show the woman their phone. Later, a rideshare driver dropped off the woman's phone to the hotel since she left it in the vehicle. On December 29th, federal prosecutors said they would not move forward in pursuing criminal charges of the officers involved in the murder of Tamir Rice, since they didn't have enough evidence. Tamir was shot in the park while playing with a BB gun at the age of 12 years old. That's a year younger than my daughter and 2 years older than my son. When we look at these snippets of events, we may wonder, why is it happening? It's not just happening with police. It's happening on a systematic level. These last few incidents that have unfolded at the close of the year tells us that while yes, we must take to the streets, and while yes, we must adjust our business practice and our models of ministry to be more inclusive, they also remind us that we cannot legalize morality. And if we want to see lasting change that transforms our society longer than a news cycle, we must begin to unpack and honestly deal with the legacy of racism in America. We must begin to deal with the ways it has impacted our minds and our hearts, understanding how it has marred the very image of God in our Black and brown brothers and sisters. Colonialism has been an oppressive tool that's been used to erase and diminish the humanity of Blacks. The identity of Black people in America has been under constant attack, contorted, and manipulated for the sake of the privileged and powerful. By denying the humanity of Black people, this whiteness, this ideology has been crafted to create an identity that is contrary to what it means to be created in the image of God. When this happens, misrecognition occurs. Misrecognition is not simply a sociological problem. It's a theological, it's a human problem as well. Beloved, when we deny the humanity in others, we prevent ourselves from seeing God fully. When we misrecognize those created in the image of God, we run the risk of misrecognizing God. That is why when we cry out and say their names, is because what we're saying is to see them, see their humanity, know their names, who they are. But often folks are misrecognized in lots of different ways. And over the next several weeks, we'll spend time unpacking and understanding this more. Moving towards anti-race beliefs requires a deep and honest look at the stories we believe about each other and ourselves. We are all on our ongoing racial, ethnic, and cultural identity journey, and the journey is different for each of us. Recent events tells us that we must begin with unearthing not just the roots of America's original sin, but what it birthed in our society and within each of us as well. This means acknowledging how our communities have contributed to anti-Blackness. This will require a willingness to examine the deeply rooted anti-Black ideology within us. If we confront anti-Blackness, we will then be able to confront how the same narratives affect other racial and ethnic groups as well. Within our small groups and throughout our time, we'll continue to discuss how so much of this is guided by America's original sin and how whiteness continues to push this forward. I just want to remind us that our goals for our time in this series is to deconstruct anti-Black narratives. We're going to spend time understanding the impact of what we call controlling narratives. And I use the word controlling narratives instead of stereotypes because controlling narratives move in such a way that we believe them to be true, and people then begin to internalize them and own them for themselves. And expect that to be what is. So it shapes a reality. We're going to talk about the process and the ways we've internalized these narratives and how it's contributed to oppression. And my hope is that we'll also create space to begin the journey towards racial justice and healing.